Good morning, church. I'm so glad that you're here. I had a thought while Pastor Jason was talking about 6-minute sermons. I'm excited. That's going to be a good day. You're going to hear from some new voices that you've never heard from before. It's going to be great. But I was laughing to myself, Pastor Jason, because I thought we're going to prove that day that 6 people can preach faster than I will preach today, probably. It's crazy, right? So, are you clapping for that, Frank? You're not sure, right? Like, do I clap? If I clap, is he going to preach faster or slower? You don't know. Hey, kids camp was just this last week. They just got home yesterday. We have a picture of our group coming home right before they came home. By the way, they're holding up number 1. Because they were on the yellow team, and yellow team won. So they're really, really excited. And I just want to give a shout out, especially to our leaders, Pastor Lisa and Julie and Aaron and Guy. These leaders, I'm telling you, what an amazing week at camp. And I have one video. It's really short. Lisa last night was showing me all of her pictures and all of her videos. I'm like, oh, we got to share this one. So the setup is that the kids play games all week, but also the leaders play games, and they're winning points for their teams. And I love, like, our leaders. Lisa was telling me last night, she said, I met with our kids, and I said, I don't know if you've heard Pastor Jason or your parents talking about all in, but we're all in this week at camp. We're all in with the games. We're all in at the services. We're all in on everything. And our leaders, they were like, we're all in too. And so they played this game, and you're going to see in a second, our guys were playing a game called Tug of War, and I'm just so proud. I'm so proud of our guys. These guys, okay, that's it. Let's watch the video as these guys whoop up on the competition. That's Pastor Johnny and Guy Gleason and Aaron Wilson, and they're schooling. I don't even know who the other team is, but watch the very end. They're about... Isn't that fun? And Guy Gleason told me yesterday, I was thanking him, all the leaders. I'm like, thank you. And Guy said, you know what, Pastor Jason, I had so much fun that I told Pastor Lisa, I'm going to serve in Harvest Kids. And he started today. Isn't that awesome? I mean, I'm not going to say that I like some people better than others, but I like leaders like that just like, that's awesome, right? So thank you, all of you. And our kids are going to youth camp this week. They leave Wednesday. So I asked you last week to be in prayer for our kids, and a bunch of you did that. How many of you will be in prayer this week for our youth as they leave for camp? This seems to be a life-changing week. I promise it's going to be amazing. So let's keep them in prayer this week. So we've been talking for quite a while about the promises of God. And lately, what we've done is we've gone to Hebrews chapter 11. It's known as the Hall of Fame for Faith. And there's all these people listed, men and women of God. And so we've been pulling their stories out to look at how did they hold on to the promises of God. I think there's some lessons to be learned there. And today is the verse that we're starting with. It starts out, it's not about a person that's listed in Hebrews 11. It's actually about an event. And so we're going to look at this event today. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30 is our starting place. And it says this, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. So this is the event. This is going to be our launch point today. How many of you have heard this story before? The story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho, right? Joshua and the walls of Jericho. You can find this story and all its details in Joshua chapter 6. We're going to go there for most of the day today. Joshua chapter 6. Let me just tell you what's going on as we begin this story. The people of God are on a journey to a place that's actually called the Promised Land, which I think is interesting. This land has been promised to them, and they're on a journey, and it's been a long time. It's been a long journey, and they're fighting battles along the way, and they're conquering the enemy, and they find themselves on the plains of Jericho. And in front of them is this massive city. And what you need to know about Jericho is at the time, Jericho was one of the oldest inhabited cities in the known world. In other words, it had lasted the test of time. It had been attacked before, and it stood the test. It had survived. And so they're looking at this city, and its trademark defense was actually its walls. That's why it's called Joshua and the walls of Jericho. And yes, plural. It was not just one wall, it was actually two walls. They had this amazing defense system set up. And so they had an outer wall, and the outer wall, get this, was 7 feet thick. And it was made of rocks and stone, and it was about 20 to 30 feet tall, depending on where it was as you kind of went around the city. And then there was an inner wall, and the inner wall, get this, twice as big as the outer wall. 14 feet thick of stone and rock, and at some places it was 40 feet tall. I mean, so you can imagine the people of God on the plains of Jericho, they're looking at this wall and they're shaking their heads and like, what are we going to do? And if that wasn't enough, they also added something. There was a giant ditch in front of the first wall that was about 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep. So here's the deal. When they built this to defend their city, they wanted to make sure that when the enemy came, that the enemy was in a vulnerable position so that they could defeat the enemy. So they're standing up on top of these big, giant, thick walls, and the enemy's down in a ditch, and they can't use a battering ram because they're down in a ditch, and most of their weapons, are kind of fruitless at this point. And so this is the city that Joshua and the army are staring down as they're standing on the plains of Jericho. When you looked at this city and you planned an attack, you might find yourself saying words like this: it's impossible. There's no way. The walls are impenetrable. There's no way we're going to do this. And I don't know if you've ever found yourself in a situation like that, where you describe it as impossible or no way or impenetrable. I found myself in a few of those. How many of you like doing puzzles? Does anyone like doing puzzles? My wife loves doing puzzles, and one of her things is over Christmas break, she'll pick a new puzzle, and it's usually a kind of a big puzzle, and she'll kind of work on it throughout, the week of Christmas, and our niece Rebecca likes doing it with her, and the girls kind of like it. So they'll have a table all set up for the puzzles. I'll just tell you right now, you could lock me in a room with a puzzle and say, you get to come out when you complete the puzzle, and you would never see me again, all right? Like, my brain does not work that way. So what I do, because I kind of want to, feel a part of it, is every time I pass by the puzzle table, I just pause and I kind of look over their shoulders. I give it about 30 seconds. And in the 30 seconds, if I don't see something that matches, I move on, all right? But eventually, especially as they get closer to finishing it, eventually I spot a piece, okay? And I put that piece in, and the reason I do that is at the end, I want to claim, wasn't that amazing how we did that puzzle? Right? 1,000 pieces, they did 999, I did one. When I look at puzzles, I'm like, this is impossible. Like, how do you do this, This is going to tell me a lot about you, so just think about it before you respond. How many of you like IKEA? How many of you like IKEA? Okay, if your hand's raised, I am praying for you right now. I've interceded for you. I hate IKEA, y'all. Listen, why? Why would you buy furniture that you have to put together? I mean, come on. I don't understand this concept at all. A couple of years ago, we bought some new furniture for the offices here, and our staff at the time was like, oh, we need to order IKEA. And I'm like, whatever. And so we ordered IKEA, and all these boxes came in, flat boxes. I'm like, this doesn't look like furniture. They're like, well, you got to put it together. I'm like, that's stupid. Y'all go put it together, Because I'm just telling you, have you ever looked at the instructions on IKEA furniture? First word, impossible. No way, I'm not doing this, right? And I'm kind of having some fun, but here's the reality. If you found yourself, or maybe you're there now, in a situation that you would describe as impossible, it's not fun at all. It's not fun. For some of you, you've been there or you are there, you'd say, my impossible situation is my marriage. For some of you, you'd say, my impossible situation's at my job. For some of you, it has to do with your children, or others, it might have to do with a health diagnosis. You look at it and you just say, it's impossible. There's no way we're going to do this. How am I going to get victory in this? We've been talking about promises. How am I going to get to the promise? And I think that today's story out of Jericho, out of Joshua, about Jericho, I think it gives us a lot of hope. Joshua chapter 2, verse 2, we begin this story. It says, then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. I just want you to notice as we're starting the story, God is talking to Joshua, okay? Present tense. God said to Joshua. He's having a conversation, but listen to what he says. See, I have delivered Jericho. So he's talking in real time, but he's using this past tense, right? He's saying, see, and he's looking at the walls, right? But he's saying, I have delivered, right? So just look at the person sitting next to you, say, have delivered. Just say those words, because I want you to get this today. What he's doing is he's going ahead and he's giving Joshua a picture of the miracle before Joshua even gets into the battle, right? He's giving a glimpse. In other words, I might just say it this way. He's giving Joshua a promise, right? They're looking at the walls, but he's saying, Joshua, I've already taken care of this. I've already delivered. I've already healed you. I've already taken care of your kids. I'm already at work in your marriage. He's giving a promise. And, as we've dug into the promises of God, what I believe, in fact, I know this because some of you have shared with me, is some of you have really dug in and you've got in God's word and you've spent time in his presence. And as you've done that, he's made you promises. So he's promised you a healing. He's promised you provision. He's promised to take care of you. He's promised. And what I want you to see today is what God's doing. He did just what he did with Joshua, is he's showing you the miracle before you even get into the battle. It's like knowing the end from the beginning, right? I already know because God has promised, and we know this because we keep saying it week after week after week, for he who promises faithful. So how do we believe for a miracle when we can't see it? When all we see is the giant walls in front of us? God gives Joshua some instruction. Here's the instruction, verse 3. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout, and then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. I'm not going to read it for the sake of time, but from verses 6 through 19, the next section of verses, Joshua and the army, they obey every single command that the Lord, to a T, right? He gave them the instruction manual, and they went through it, and they made sure that they did everything that God had spoken. And then this is the end result, verse 20. When the trumpets sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpets, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. I just want to be sure that you see this today. God's promise matched reality. It happened as he said it would happen. He always keeps his word. His promise matched reality. And this is why we spend so long talking about promises. This is what happens when God's people hold on to the promises. Now, I've heard this story a bunch of times. I'll just tell you, I grew up in church, and this is a common story in kids' church and in youth group, and then to the parent. I've heard this story so many times. I know this story. One of the things, it's always intrigued me, the specific instructions that God gives to Joshua. And the reason this is important is because the key to the victory wasn't actually in the instructions, right? Think about it. It wasn't in the fact that they marched around the city. It wasn't the 6 days or the seventh day or the ram's horn. It wasn't the trumpets, even though I think that'd be fun because I played trumpet in high school, and I think it'd be cool if there were one verse that gave trumpets that power. I just think it'd be really cool. It wasn't the trumpets. It wasn't any of these things. I want you to see this today. The key to the victory is simply their obedience. It's just their obedience. It wasn't any of the specific things. It was all of it together. It was just that they obeyed what God spoke to them. I might say it this way. They were in God's will. They were doing God's will, right? They were right in God's will. And here's why that's important. When you're in God's will, you can expect Him to show up. When you're in God's will, you can expect Him to fight on your behalf. When you're in God's will, there's an expectation that He's going to keep His word. There's an expectation that His promises are going to come true. But some people, in my professional opinion, complicate this idea of the will of God. It's a common theme in church. It's a common theme as people will come in and talk to me. It's usually said like this: Pastor, I just want to know what God's will is. If I knew what God's will is, I would do it. Pastor, what's God's will for my family? Pastor, what's God's will for my marriage? What's God's will? And here's where I think we sometimes complicate it. I don't know if you've ever heard this phrase or used this phrase before, but I think this has kind of hurt us in the discussion about God's will. Is some people will talk about it this way. They'll use the phrase, the perfect will of God. Have you ever heard that phrase? The perfect will of God. Hey, I'll try to illustrate it. So I brought a whiteboard today to help illustrate it. And you're going to be amazed, prepare to be amazed at my artistic abilities, okay? Because just get ready, okay? Are you ready for it? The perfect will of God. All right? Are you ready to be amazed? Ta-da! I'll be here all week. This is the picture. You're living your life. There's all these places you can go and all these things you can do and all kinds of stuff going on. And then some well-meaning, Bible person, teacher comes and says, but what you need is the perfect will of God, right? And my voice just does it automatically. It's not, I don't even try. Just that's where it goes. And it's like, it's this idea that like, if I don't, I'll think of it from like the perspective of like a high school senior. This is what they look at. If I don't go to the right school at the right time, I won't meet my right future spouse, and then we won't be in the right city later to do the perfect exact thing that God has created us to do. Can I just help you? That is way too much pressure. I mean, way, way too much pressure. It's this idea it's like right there, right? I remember hearing this message when I was a young adult that really set me free in this area because it described the will of God. Like you have to overlap the themes in Scripture. One of the themes you just can't miss in Scripture is the theme of grace. Do you see grace in the Scripture? It's like everywhere, right? Overlap the grace of God with the will of God, and all of a sudden, the perfect will of God, it doesn't even make sense. It's this idea that the grace of God, right? It's like, here's the deal. He can bless you in any profession, right? He can bless you in any city you live in. He can bless, there's this grace that, here's the deal. If you're freaked out that I'm going to miss the will of God, you're probably not going to miss the will of God because you're trying to follow His ways, right? And so it's this idea that there's so much out there. And here's the deal. Do I believe God has a plan for you? Absolutely. How do you find out the plan God has for you? You spend time with Him. You listen for His voice. But I just want to relieve you of this pressure that I have to find the perfect will of God. The perfect will of God. The perfect. How in the world? What does God want for me and my family? Don't overcomplicate the will of God. Here, maybe this will help you. God's will is not an itinerary. It's not a set of where to be and when to be. And it's not an itinerary, but it's a position of the heart. The will of God it's an attitude, right? It's not so much about what or where or how. It's an attitude. It's this idea that I just want to please God. Every day I'm starting out just saying, God, I just want to please you today. Whatever you have for me, wherever you want me to go, whoever you want me to talk to, whatever you want me to do, it's just this general attitude. And I just promise you, if you're carrying this attitude around on a daily basis, you're not going to miss the will of God, because now your whole focus is simply, I just want to please Him. That's whatever He wants for me. I'm just going to live my life, and wherever the Holy Spirit directs, I'm going to go there. I'm going to surrender to His will. So how do we get from where God has promised that He's going to take us, right? How do we get there from where we are? Because for most of us, there's a battle of sorts between where we are and the thing that God has promised us. And so how do we get there? I think this story out of Joshua really helps us to see some principles that might help you today. The first one would be this, is you got to see what God sees. You got to see what God sees. You position yourself to be able to see the things that God sees. I don't know if you're seeing a trend in several of these messages, but I hope you are, actually. I hope that one of the things you're seeing is that the way you find out what God sees is by having a vibrant prayer life. I can promise you, Joshua had a vibrant spiritual life. It doesn't tell us this, right? It doesn't say that Joshua fasted and prayed. It doesn't say that. But I promise you, he had a vibrant spiritual life because he was in communication with God. He heard the voice of God, and God began to show him what he was seeing instead of just what Joshua was seeing. Go back to verse 2, and it says, the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, right? See, look, he's showing Joshua, I know what you see is a 30-foot ditch and a 7-foot thick wall and another 14-foot thick, 40 foot. I know what you see, but Joshua, let me show you something else. When you see what God sees, you begin to look at things differently. And I think you'll agree with this. I think what the world needs today so bad is a church who will see what God sees so we can have a different perspective on what everyone else is seeing. I mean, the reality is we're all seeing in the natural the same events, the same things. We're reading the same stories. We have the same news feed. But I think when you tap in to the presence of God, He begins to show us things that you can't see just with your natural eyes. And I think that's what the world needs, is a church with a different perspective. So here's a question for you today. What are you looking at? What are you looking at? See, what most people do is they look at the challenge, right? The problem. And here's the idea. When you're looking at the obstacles, your obstacles look really big. Have you ever seen that? It's just like when that it consumes you, when that's what you're looking at. It's all you think about. It's you're trying to figure out, how am I going to get through this? And when you're looking at the obstacles, they look really big. But can I help you today? Because I'm asking, what are you looking at? When you look at God, your obstacles begin to look really small. What are you looking at today? We got to see what God sees. Joshua had plenty of reason to doubt, to fear. He's looking physically at these giant walls, but God began to show him something else. And some of you today, you're listening, you're thinking about the promises of God, and you're thinking back on maybe a promise that He's made to you. But here's what we tend to do, human nature. Here's what we tend to do, is we know the promises of God, but what gets in our way is the buts, okay? It's like, God, I know that you want to restore my marriage, but do you know who I'm married to? Right? God, I know you want to heal me, but did you hear what the doctor, the medical professional said, right? God, I know that you want to help me financially, but have you seen my bank account, right? And what happens for too many of us, tried to find a nice way to say this, but your big butt gets in the way. Ava said I shouldn't do that, but I did it. So I've come today to tell you, don't let your big butt get in the way. Don't let your butt stop you, because if you'll get in the presence of God, He'll help you to see what He sees. When we take a picture, like you're somewhere and you use your phone and you take a picture or a selfie or a group shot like we did earlier with camp. When you take a picture and you look at it, something interesting happens, okay? I took a picture a week or two ago with a couple of my friends. I'll show it to you. So here's a picture. Oh my gosh. Really, I just wanted to show you a picture of my fish. That's really all it was. That's all. I don't have Facebook right now, so you get to see my giant fish. All right. So here's what happens. He's liking it. Thank you for liking it. Here's what happens. Okay, you can change put it to something else because I'm going to be so distracted. All right. Thank you. So watch this. I'm going to tell you this, and then you're going to go, and then you're going to think about it, and you're going to go, my goodness, it's right. When you take a picture and later you come back and look at it, the first person you look at in the picture is yourself. And here's what happens. Some of you are like, no, watch. Go look next time. The first person you look at yourself. And here's what happens. If you look good in the picture, what do you say? That's a great picture. Your friends, they're making funny faces, their clothes are misheveled, their hair is blown, but you're like, that is a great picture. Everyone else is smiling, but you've got a weird look on your face. You're like, oh, that's awful. We got to take a new one, right? Am I right? I'm just saying, when you take a picture and you look at it, the first thing, it's who we are, okay? Is the first thing we do is we look at ourselves in the picture. And here's the idea, is that too often in our lives, we get too focused on ourselves. We forget that there are others in the picture, but even more importantly, we forget that God is in the picture. So I'm asking you today, what are you looking at? We got to see what God sees. Not just what's right in front of us, but God, what are you seeing? And I'll just tell you, if you're not seeing what God's seeing, then here it's just this simple. You're not drawing close to Him. Which is a great time for me to remind you of our theme verse this year. I love this verse, James 4:8. Come near to God, and what? He will come near to you. In that coming near, what happens is He begins to show you His perspective on your situation. He begins to show you the things that He is seeing. So you got to see what God sees. Here's the second thing is obey God's ways even when you don't understand. Parents, I think you'll relate to this. What's the classic parent response when you give your kids an instruction and they say, why? Right? What do you say? Because I said so, right? Because I said so. And we say it as if that should be enough, right? Which it should be. It should be. And here's what happens. God asks us to do something, and we sometimes, I know I do, we ask God, why? Why? Why are you asking me to do this? Why do you want me to tithe, right? Why do you want me to go all in? God, why do you want me to forgive? They should forgive first, right? God, why, right? And so often His response is the same response you give to your kid, because I said so. Except, let me just tell you, in this case, God, if God said it, that should be enough of a reason, right? Because He said so, right? We got to obey God's commands even when it doesn't make sense. If we're not careful, the why will keep us from obeying the Lord. It'll keep us from that. For Joshua, right, God's instructions, they didn't make any sense at all, right? He's looking at the ditch and the wall and the history, And then God gives him this incredibly ludicrous plan of marching around in silence and blowing trumpets and priests and the ark and the seven and the shout and it's like, can I just be honest? I don't know if you ever do this. Sometimes I think that I could come up with better ideas than God. Anyone else? I mean, like I'm reading this story and I'm like, oh, this is ridiculous, God. What you should have done is you should have had fighter pilots fly over the city and soften the walls up. And you should have put Joshua in a tank with a flamethrower attachment, because flames are cool, right? And you should have equipped all of the priests with hand grenades. That would have been fun, right? What could go wrong? Priests with hand grenades, right? And I'm just telling you, my imagination, all of a sudden, I have come up with a really great plan for Joshua to defeat the walls of Jericho. And I'm looking at God's plan. I'm like, that is just a silly, silly plan. So Joshua had a choice to make. Am I going to obey God even though his plan doesn't seem to make sense? And what's interesting is in the passage that we have in front of us, we don't ever see Joshua question this. We don't ever see the people of God griping and complaining and doubting. We don't see a shred of doubt. We simply see them obeying. Joshua believed God. He trusted God. And he obeyed God. It's really that simple. Joshua believed that what God promised was going to come true. So he trusted that and he obeyed. He obeyed even though the instructions didn't make sense. And here's the reality. Over and over and over in the Bible, we see men and women and stories of people who obey God even though it doesn't make sense. Think about it. David went up against a giant with what? Slingshot. That doesn't make sense. Samson fought off an entire army with the jawbone of a donkey. That doesn't make sense. Jehoshaphat was going to war. He didn't send, the snipers in. He sent worshipers in. That does not make any sense. The disciples come back from fishing all night. They don't catch anything. And Jesus shows up and says, you should go back out and cast on the other side of Duh, why didn't we think of that, Jesus? Right? It doesn't make any sense for them to go back out and to follow the instruction. So many people, they said to Jesus when he didn't respond fast enough when they heard about Lazarus. Right? Jesus, you should have come faster, right? Why didn't you drop everything and come? I mean, over and over we just see these stories of obedience when it doesn't make sense. People didn't like that Jesus hung out with sinners. They didn't like it when he walked up to the trees, said, Lazarus, come on, we're going to Starbucks today, right? I mean, people got all bent out of shape. I mean, over and over, there's just this principle. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he goes to the cross, he's asking God, isn't there another way? Can't we accomplish this a different way? Do I have to go to the cross? And I'm just telling you, there's this theme throughout the Bible of obeying even when it doesn't make sense. So this might help you today. This might set some of you free. Stop strategizing and start obeying. Stop trying to figure it all out and just obey. It was mentioned earlier, Pastor Jason mentioned the all-in thing that we're doing right now. And man, so many of you have come on board with this. It's just really been fun to watch you and your family take these faith steps. And let me make it really simple. My ask of you and your family is this. Ask God what he wants you to do and obey. That's all it is. Ask God what he has for you and your family, and then have the courage, the trust to just obey, even if what he asks you to do doesn't make sense. So do you see what God sees? Can you obey when it doesn't make sense? Number 3, availability is more important than ability. Availability is so important. God looks for those who are available, not just those that are able. In fact, what's interesting is that often God will use someone who is less able than another simply because they've made themselves available. Think about our story. God didn't ask Joshua and his army to do a complicated, difficult thing, right? March around the city, count to 6, shout. I mean, a 4-year-old could have accomplished this. But it makes me think, right? Well, why did he do that? Well, maybe because they were just surrendered to God. Maybe they were just available. God, whatever you want to accomplish through me, I'll just keep showing up. I'll just be available. God didn't care how strong they were or were not. He didn't care how talented they were. He didn't care how smart they were. He's simply looking for people who are available. And here's one of the things that complicates it is we live in a society that celebrates ability. We live in a society that tells you that if you're more talented than another person, you're more valuable than another person. I don't know if you watch any of these shows, but there's television shows that really reinforce this, right? Shows like American Idol or America's Got Talent or The Voice. I mean, all of these shows, it's like it elevates the people with the most talent. I'm just thankful that God doesn't only use people who win The Voice, right? I would never win, right? I'm thankful he doesn't only pick those that rise to the top through their talent. In fact, what I think is that if God were to have his own show, I think it would just simply be called Surrendered. He's just looking for people who will surrender. God, whatever you want for my life. So don't overcomplicate it. Right? Look again at the story and pay attention to the simplicity. Do not give a war cry. Don't raise your voice. Don't say a word. When I tell you to shout, shout. So do you see what God sees? Can you obey even when it doesn't make sense? Are you available? And then the last thing I'll say today is this: trust God even when you can't see it. Trust even when the circumstances don't seem to be changing. I think we're coming to an end of this series on the promises of God. I'll give you just a sneak peek. I feel the stirring of God. I've started working on a new series that will start right after summer. We're gonna finish this through the summer, and I'm so excited. But we're talking about the promises of God, and I really felt today like I needed to come to you and just remind you not to give up. Some of you early on, you grabbed a hold of a promise and there was some excitement and passion around, man, God said something to me. I'm going to hold on to this. But as time has gone on, it's getting harder and harder to hold on because you're looking at circumstances and it doesn't seem like it's changing. And I wanted to come today to ask you not to give up, to trust in God, even when it doesn't look like anything's happening. Think about our story. Joshua, I didn't read this verse earlier, but Joshua 6 verse 14 says, so on the second day, so day one, they showed up and they marched. On the second day, they marched around the city once and they returned to camp. And then it simply says this: they did this for 6 days. Just play this out in your mind, right? Day one, morale is high, excitement's in the air, right? They come together and like, oh, guys, God spoke. He's going to do it. Look at those walls. They don't have any idea this is going to be so awesome. And then somebody missed the instruction. They're like, what are we doing again, Frank? And Frank's like, we're going to walk around the city. Really? That doesn't sound like it. Okay, well, here we go. They march around the city. Day two, they show up. Little less enthusiastic. They're looking at the wall and they're like, didn't we walk around this yesterday? Yeah, we walked around this yesterday. It still looks like it's about the same size. Yeah, it's still the same size. Nothing's happened. What are we doing today? Today the gun day? No. Today we're walking around the city. And you don't say anything. Shh. They walk around the city. Day three, they show back up. Now they're beginning to ask, right? There's like murmuring amongst the troops. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? What's going on? The wall's still there. Didn't anyone tell Joshua nothing's happening? It's still as tall. It's still as deep. It's still, what's happening? Day four, someone showed up. I promise it's not in the scripture, but I promise it happened. Day four, this is stupid. This is stupid. Why are we doing this? I mean, people are getting angry now. Why did Pastor Joshua do this? Oh, it's just stupid, right? Like, it's okay. Let's just keep walking. So now people are like, and they're grumbling while they walk, The wall is not moving. The wall is not changing. Not one stone has fallen. Day 5, they're like, I'm so tired of this. Have you ever been there? I'm tired of this. Why are we walking around this wall? Nothing has changed. Day 6, right? Now they're saying, this is not working. Nothing is changing. The wall is still there. My marriage is still in trouble. The bill's still not paid. The health diagnosis is still there. Like nothing has changed. Have you ever felt that way? Can I just ask you a question? Think about this. What would have happened if they'd stopped on day 6? Just think about it. What would have happened if 6 days they marched around the city? 6 days they obeyed the commands of God. 6 days and they get all the way there. And I'm telling you this because I've seen too many believers get to this point. It's like, but I've done it. I've been there. Nothing's happening. My marriage is not changing. You have no idea how many times I've heard that. Nothing's happening. The situation's not changed. What would have happened in this story if on day 6, which, let's be honest, 6 days, that's pretty good. That's more than most, right? Most people never got that far. What would have happened if on day 6 they just said, I've had enough of this, it's not working, I'm done, and they would have quit? I'll tell you what would have happened. They never would have seen victory. They never would have seen what God promised. He said in the beginning, see, Joshua, I have already delivered the city into your hands. I'm just telling you, the scariest place is on day 6. The hardest place is on day 6. You've obeyed, you've clung to the promises, you've been faithful, and now you get to this point of like, God, are you going to show up? And day 7, they showed back up and they obeyed. Not just part of what God told them, but everything He commanded them. And on day 7, they saw the victory. I think day 7, the morning of day 7, required the most trust, right? I think the morning of 7, that was like a new level of obedience, right? Like, is this really going to happen today like God said it was going to happen? And they obeyed God, and He came through for them. Why don't you stand with me this morning? I want to pray with you today. And what I really feel led to pray is I really feel led to pray with some of you who you've been clinging to some promises of God, and you feel like, to use language out of this story, like you're on day 6. Like, I have tried, and it's not working. It's just not working. And today, my first prayer, I've been praying over you this week, that you would see what God sees. That you'd have the perspective of God. That you'd be able to look past the walls of the natural to see what God sees for you and your situation. And then my second prayer is simply this, that you would not give up. That you would, as Hebrews says, Hebrews 10:23, let's cling to the hope that we profess. Let's hold tightly, right? Let's wrap our arms around this thing and not let go. Because I'll just tell you, I have been there where I just wanted to let go. I've been there where I'm like, I just want to give up. This thing is not changing. But I'm just telling you, I believe that God has amazing plans for you. I do. I believe that God has the power to heal you today. I believe God has the power to restore your marriage. I believe God has the power to bring your lost children home. I believe that God has a way to provide for you. I believe that. Anyone else believe those things? But we're right there. We're on day 6. Don't give up. I'm going to have our worship team. They're going to lead us in one final song. And then I'm going to come back up. I'm going to pray over you. So would you use this final couple of minutes to just prepare your heart? We're going to come back. We're going to do a couple of minutes at the very end of just spiritual warfare. We're going to press through. And we're going to believe that God's promises are true and that he's going to take care of us. Amen? Worship team, lead us in worship this morning.